The Frozen Throne and the Human Stranger. The planet Veralis was not like Earth. It was a place made of ice and silence. The sky was always gray, and the sun was too far to warm anything. The cold ruled everything, even the hearts of its people, and above all of them ruled Queen Serenia the Iceborn. Her palace was built on a frozen mountain with sharp towers that touched the clouds. Her throne was made of pure crystal, cold enough to freeze a man's blood. In second, Serenia never smiled, never laughed, and never touched anyone. She wore a crown of frost, and her skin shimmered like snow. Her eyes were pale blue, and they saw everything but felt nothing. Her people worshipped her and feared her. Some said she was a goddess. Others whispered she was cursed. But no one dared to get close. Her touch was death, and her heart was frozen in time. On the morning of the second moon cycle, the royal guard spotted fire falling from the sky. A strange object burned through the clouds and crashed into the ice plain south of the palace. The explosion was loud enough to shake the mountain. Birds flew in panic and wolves howled from distant caves. It was not a meteor, it was a ship, a human ship. Guards found the wreck quickly. Flames hissed against snow. Metal pieces were scattered everywhere. In the center of the crash was a human man. His clothes were torn, and his face was bleeding. But he was alive, barely. His lips were blue, and his hands were shaking. He held something tight in his hand, a photo they brought into the palace not out of kindness but curiosity. No human had ever stepped on Veralis before, and none had ever lived long enough to speak of it. They threw him at the queen's feet, expecting her to kill him with one look, but she did not. She stood up slowly, her long dress trailing behind her like mist. Her voice was calm and cold as she asked his name. Human coughed and looked up. His voice cracked, but he answered, "Ethan." "My name is Ethan, ma'am." Then he fainted. Right there on the icy floor, the photo slipped from his fingers. It showed a little girl holding a snowflake. Serenia stared at the photo for a long time. Then she ordered her guards to place the human in a warm chamber, not a cell. She said he was not to be harmed. The court whispered behind her back. They wondered if she had gone mad, but no one questioned her, not yet. That night, Serenia stood at her balcony watching the stars. She could not sleep. The air was still, and the stars blinked above like frozen lights. Her mind kept going back to that photo, a child smiling in snow. Something about it stirred a strange feeling in her chest, a warmth that confused her. The next day she visited the chamber where Ethan was resting. He looked weak, but he opened his eyes when she entered. He tried to sit up but failed. She walked closer, and he flinched, expecting pain, but it never came. Instead, she sat beside him and asked softly, "Why did you come here?" Ethan looked at her and said, "I didn't mean to. I was exploring a nearby system. My ship was hit by an asteroid. I crashed. I thought I would die here." She nodded slowly, still watching him. "You should have died," she said. "This world is cruel and cold like its queen." Then he did something no one ever dared before. He reached out with his hand and gently touched hers, just for a second. Her skin was colder than ice, but instead of freezing him, something strange happened. A soft glow appeared where their hands met. It spread like gentle fire across her fingers. Serenia pulled back quickly, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at her hand, then at him. He was already unconscious again, but the warmth stayed like a whisper on her skin. She left the chamber in silence, her mind spinning. What just happened? Why did she feel something? Why did his touch not freeze into pain but instead awaken something deep inside her? For the first time in her life, the Iceborn Queen felt the heat of confusion and curiosity, and somewhere hidden beneath centuries of frost, a crack appeared in her heart. A small crack, but enough for something new to grow outside. The snow kept falling, and the wind howled across the mountains. But inside the palace, something had changed forever. The cold halls of the palace had never felt so quiet. Serenia walked through them with slow steps, her fingers still tingling from the strange warmth she felt the day before. No one had ever touched her and lived before. No one had dared. She had always believed that her skin could only bring death. Her power was born from the ancient glaciers of Veralis, passed down by bloodline and myth. Her people called her a living storm, a frozen flame, a queen who could shatter stone with a breath. But now she felt something different, something that did not belong in her world. And she could not stop thinking about it, the human named Ethan had touched her skin, and instead of pain it brought a strange glow, a glow that still danced faintly on her palm. She had tried to scrub it off in silence, tried to bury it in logic and fear, but it would not fade in the chamber. Ethan remained asleep. His breathing was shallow and his skin pale, but alive. He had survived the cold of Varellus longer than any creature from Earth. Should have some of the guards said he was cursed. Others said he was a trick, a weapon from the stars. But Serenia was not sure. She had felt truth in that touch, and it scared her more than death. She sat beside his bed again, watching him closely. The room was warm, lit by soft blue crystals that gave heat without flame. He stirred for the first time, eyes fluttering open. Slowly he looked at her and gave a tired smile. "You came back," he whispered. His voice was dry like dust, but his words were clear. Serenia did not smile, but her gaze softened. "Why did your touch not kill?" she asked. "What are you?" Ethan blinked slowly, then laughed weakly. "Maybe I am just lucky, or maybe you are not what you think you are. Maybe you are not meant to freeze everything. Maybe you are meant to feel." The queen stood still. Her heart beat once loudly, then again. She had not felt her heartbeat in years, not like this. She turned away from him, walked toward the door, then paused. "You are to stay here," she said. "You are not a prisoner, but you are not free either." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "But thank you for not killing." Mesh did not answer and left quietly. The walls of the palace seemed colder after that, as if jealous of the heat between them. Days passed, and Ethan grew stronger. He began to walk through the chamber, speak to the guards, and even hum strange Earth songs to himself. The palace staff kept their distance, but they whispered more and more. The queen had not frozen him. The queen visited him almost daily. The queen had changed it. Serenia herself felt it too. She could no longer ignore it. Her reflection in the ice mirror no longer showed the same woman. Her skin glowed slightly and her eyes had more color. Her frost-covered throne felt harder to sit upon. Her voice did not echo the same way. She began to ask Ethan more questions about Earth, about warmth, about how humans lived and touched and loved. He answered everything with patience and sometimes a smile. He told her about campfires and ocean waves, about laughter and hugs, about a thing called music and how it made people dance without reason. "You sound like a world without pain," Serenia said quietly. Ethan shook his head softly. "We have pain," he said, "but we also have healing. Maybe you have had only the first half of the story. Maybe it is time for the second." One night, as the wind screamed outside and the snow whipped the towers, Serenia stood again at her balcony. This time she did not feel alone. Her thoughts wandered to him again, not as a stranger, but as something else, something dangerous and comforting at the same time. The next morning she called for Ethan to be brought to the great library of Varellus, a place no outsider had ever seen. The room was made of frozen light and books written in languages that no longer existed. He looked around in awe, then turned to her, confused. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked. "Because I want you to teach me," she said quietly. "Teach me about the part of the world that does not freeze. Teach me how to feel." Ethan looked into her eyes for a long time, then nodded slowly. "All right, Your Majesty, but learning to feel is not easy. It can hurt." Serenia closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "I think I'm ready for that pain." And with that, the Ice Queen stepped off her frozen path and into something unknown. A new season had begun inside her, one she had never seen before, one where fire and ice could maybe exist together, not as enemies, but as balance. Ethan had never seen anything like the great library of Varellus. Its walls shimmered like frozen waterfalls, and each step echoed softly across the ancient floors. Strange symbols moved across the ice-covered shelves, glowing and fading like forgotten dreams. He followed Queen Serenia in silence, his breath fogging in the cold air. She moved like wind through still trees, graceful and silent, but something about her had changed. No longer looked untouchable. Her hair still flowed like silver frost. and her eyes held the storm of 1,000 winters. But now they also held curiosity and something softer, something human. Her guards watched from a distance, unsure and uneasy. They had never seen their queen walk beside anyone as an equal. Ethan paused. In front of a large crystal embedded in the wall, it showed an old image carved deep into the ice. A woman surrounded by flames holding a frozen child. He touched it gently and turned to Serenia. "What does this mean?" he asked. Serenia stared at it for a moment. "That is the first queen of my bloodline," she said. "Her mother was of fire, her father was of frost. Their union brought balance to the world and gave birth to me. But the fire was lost long ago, and only the cold remained. Maybe it did not disappear," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe it was just waiting for the right spark." They sat together in the center of the library as the ice walls shifted around them. Serenia spoke of her past, of centuries alone, of fear of becoming weak, and of how she built her strength on distance and silence. Ethan told her about Earth, about families, about mistakes and hope, and about how sometimes being strong meant being open. As the hours passed, a strange warmth began to grow between them, not from fire but from presence, from words shared in truth. The crystals on the walls began to hum faintly, reacting to something ancient and powerful that had not stirred in lifetimes. Later that night, Ethan was escorted back to his chamber, but Serenia stayed behind. Her hand rested on the old crystal wall. The frozen woman with the fire in her arms seemed to look back at her now, as if awakening an old memory, one she had buried deep within her soul. The next morning the palace was buzzing. A strange sound had echoed through the halls the night before, a low pulsing beat like a heartbeat from beneath the ground. The Council of Frost Lords gathered in secret, whispering of omens and change. They believed the human had done something unnatural. They called him a danger, a disease of warmth. They urged the queen to send him away before the old balance was broken. Serenia did not listen. Instead, she summoned Ethan to walk the ice garden with her, a place where only royalty could go. The garden was filled with frozen flowers shaped like stars and vines that grew icicles instead of leaves. In the center stood a tree made of pure sapphire, said to be planted by the first queen herself. They stood beneath it in silence until Ethan spoke softly. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. "I am not like you. I don't belong here." Serenia looked at him and replied, "You are the only one who has touched me and made me feel alive. That is more belonging than anyone else has given me." He stepped closer, watching her carefully. Then, "Why do you still hold back? Why do you hide behind this garden?" "Because I am afraid," she whispered. "Not of death, not of battle, but of being broken by something I cannot control." Ethan reached out slowly and took her hand again. Her fingers trembled in his grip, but she did not pull away. The warmth returned, stronger this time, like a quiet flame pushing through thick snow. And as they stood together, the sapphire tree pulsed with light, sending a wave of soft blue across the garden. Unseen by them, a shadow moved in the tower above. One of the Frost Lords had seen everything, his face twisted with anger and fear. The queen was falling. The human was changing her, and if left unchecked, he would melt the entire kingdom. That night Serenia returned to the great library alone and stood before the ancient mirror of truth, a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your soul. For the first time in her life, she saw herself not as a queen, but as a woman, one with sorrow in her heart and hope in her eyes. The image of Ethan stood beside her, not as a threat, but as light in her darkness. She touched the mirror gently and whispered, "If this is who I am now, then let the world see me far beneath the palace." Unknown to both of them, something ancient stirred. A heartbeat echoed again in the deepest ice. The fire of the forgotten queen had awakened, and it was no longer content to sleep. The wind outside howled like a beast in pain as thick snow blanketed the palace towers, but inside the ice garden silence reigned. Queen Serenia stood near the sapphire tree alone, her fingers gently touching the trunk, as if hoping to understand what had changed within her since the human came. Her breath misted the air, but her chest felt warm, as if something inside her was burning quietly, not destroying, but softening like a candle held in trembling hands. She closed her eyes and let the memory return the moment. Ethan had touched her hand again, the pulse that ran through her, the way her guards had stepped back as the blue light danced around them. No one had ever dared to speak to her with such honesty, and no one had ever looked into her eyes without fear. But Ethan did not fear her. He saw something else, something she had forgotten. Long ago, the next morning, she ordered the palace to remain silent. No court, no visitors, no politics. Just one request: bring Ethan to the glacier balcony, the place where her kind meditated above the endless snowfields where even the stars looked. Cold, she stood there with her cloak flowing like a shadow against the sky, watching as he approached dressed in thick fur with wonder in his eyes. "Why here?" he asked, his voice soft against the wind. "Because this is where I come when I do not want to." "Be queen," she replied. "This is where I am just a soul frozen in time." Ethan stepped beside her, the edge of the balcony dropping into a sea of white clouds. "I can see why you come here," he said. "It is beautiful and lonely." She looked at him for a long time and then asked something that made her voice tremble. "Do you miss your home?" He nodded a little. "Sometimes. I miss the trees and the sky, the smell of rain, and the sound of people laughing, but more than anything, I miss feeling connected to someone." Her heart clenched with a strange ache, something old, something human. "I have never been connected to anyone," she whispered. "Not since the day I was crowned. I was told that closeness brings weakness, and weakness leads to destruction. Maybe it is time to question that. Maybe strength can grow from connection too," he said, and reached out his hand. She hesitated, but then placed her fingers over his. The warmth between them was no longer a surprise, but what came next was Serenia looked down and saw something glisten on her palm. Not frost, not ice, but water. A single warm tear had fallen from her eye and landed on her skin. She stared at it as if it were a foreign object, a sign of something broken. But Ethan only smiled gently. "You are not broken," he said softly. "You are healing." Serenia turned away quickly, unable to hide the emotions rushing through her like a river cracking the ice. She walked along the balcony's edge, her thoughts spinning like a storm. How could a single human affect her so deeply? How had her centuries of silence been undone by words and touch below the balcony? The snow shifted slightly. Something moved beneath it, unseen but aware. Ancient frost creatures that guarded the mountains sensed the change. They whispered through the wind, "The queen's heart is thawing, and the old ice grows restless." That evening Serenia called for no one. She returned to her private chamber, a room carved from solid glacier, where only she could enter. The walls reflected her face 1,000 times, each colder than the last, but tonight she saw color in her cheeks and fire in her eyes. She sat by the frozen fountain and stared at her hands, once deadly, now trembling with feeling. A knock at the entrance broke the silence. Ethan's voice followed. "May I come in?" She opened the door without a word and let him step inside. The room was colder than any part of the palace, but he did not flinch. He walked to her and sat beside the fountain. "I know something is happening," he said. "You do not have to explain it, not now, but I want you to know. I am here not because I must be, but because I choose to be." She looked at him, a strange mixture of fear and gratitude in her gaze. "Why would you choose to stay in a place where everything wants to freeze you?" "Because I believe there is something worth saving beneath the ice," he replied, "and you are not alone anymore." For the first time in her long reign, Queen Serenia allowed herself to lean gently against another being. Her head rested on Ethan's shoulder. The fountain behind them shimmered, and a soft crack echoed as the surface broke, revealing the first drop of living water in 100 years. In that quiet moment, with no crown, no throne, no guards, she wept silently, not out of sorrow, but out of relief, and the snow outside slowed, as if the world itself was listening to her heart. The palace of Varellus no longer felt the same. The icy air still lingered in the halls, and the frost still curled across the ceilings, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was not loud or visible, but it was real, and the people felt it. The guards spoke in hushed voices. The servants avoided eye contact, and the Frost Lords, the ancient council who served under Queen Serenia, watched in growing silence and fear. They had ruled beside her for centuries with cold logic and quiet obedience. They had kept outsiders away and ensured the queen remained untouched emotionally and physically. They believed her strength came from isolation, that the throne survived only because she remained distant and frozen. But now that belief was under threat. Whispers filled the great halls. They say he walks beside her. Now they say she listens to him. They say he touched her and lived. The secret chamber beneath the northern spire, the Frost Lords gathered their breath, visible in the still air. Lord Tharn, the oldest among them, pounded his crystal cane against the floor. The human must leave, he declared. He is changing her, making her soft, and softness is weakness. If she melts, we all fall. Others nodded grimly. They spoke of old prophecies. Of the day the ice would crack from within, not by fire or blade, but by warmth and will. They feared that day had come, and they feared. Ethan, we will not confront her yet, said Lord Tharn. Her power still surpasses ours, but we can act in the shadows. Quietly he must disappear. At that same moment, in the Sapphire Garden, Queen Serenia and Ethan walked beneath glowing branches. The ice flowers shimmered in their presence, as if responding to the warmth between them. Serenia looked different, not just in the way she dressed without her usual crown, or the way she allowed her hair to fall freely, but in her eyes there was depth, now in a light that had never been there before. Do you regret coming here? She asked him quietly. After all, you landed into a frozen world ruled by a woman who could have killed you. Ethan smiled as he bent down to touch one of the frost lily. It melted slightly beneath his fingers, revealing a deep purple center. No, I do not regret it, he said, because I think I found something here that I never knew I was looking for. She turned her gaze to him, curious. What did you find? A soul trapped in ice, he said, and maybe my purpose is to set it free. She looked away quickly, her voice low. I do not know who I am without the ice. Then maybe it is time to find out, he replied gently. That night, as the moon rose above the palace and painted the towers with silver light, Serenia returned to her chamber, but Ethan never made it back to his room was empty. When the guards checked, his belongings were untouched. His coat still lay on the chair, but he was gone. When word reached the queen the next morning, her voice cracked for the first time in the throne room. Where is he? She demanded, her tone sharp and shaken. The guards knelt in fear and confusion. None had seen him leave, none had heard anything. Serenia rushed to the ice garden, her heart pounding. She searched every corridor, every quiet chamber, the library, the balcony, even the glacier throne, but he was nowhere to be found. Her hands trembled, and for a moment frost began to creep from her fingertips. Again the old power threatening to return. She summoned the Frost Lords, her eyes blazing, but her voice cold enough to kill someone. If I find you had anything to do with his disappearance, I will shatter every oath ever made in this palace. Lord Tharn bowed deeply. We know nothing, your Majesty. Perhaps the human left on his own. Perhaps he feared what he could not understand. You lie, she said sharply. He feared nothing. She turned and left the room before the ice in her veins could drown her again. Her feet carried her back to the place where it had all begun, the crash site. Now buried under snow, she fell to her knees and placed her hand against the ground. Her voice broke. Ethan, where are you? A soft wind answered her, but brought no words, only silence and snowflakes. But something else stirred deep below the palace. Beneath the roots of the sapphire tree, the ancient heartbeat pulsed once more, louder than before, and the frost beneath the mountain groaned, as if something buried long ago had begun to awaken. The queen stood slowly, the snow melting beneath her boots, her eyes full of pain and fire. He was not gone. She could feel it. Something inside her would not let her believe it. She would find him, and she would not rest until the truth was uncovered, even if it meant freezing the world to do so. The skies over Varellus darkened with unnatural clouds as Queen Serenia stood at the edge of the sapphire cliff, her gown billowing like a banner of winter behind her, and her eyes locked on the horizon with fury unlike anything the land had seen in centuries. The snowstorm she summoned swept across the mountains faster than any natural force. It obeyed no season, no wind. It was her rage unleashed, and the world shivered beneath it. Towns Below the palace were buried under walls of ice rivers turned to jagged blue stone, and trees snapped under the weight of sudden frost. The sky itself seemed to freeze above the peaks. Animals fled deep into their dens, and even the fiercest predators of the north disappeared in silence. Nothing was safe from the storm of the Ice Queen's heartbreak. The palace trembled with every pulse of her grief. The servants whispered of a curse. The Frost Lords watched in growing terror. Lord Tharn gathered the council once more, but their voices were no longer firm. They had seen what Serenia was capable of when her emotions ruled her. They had lit the fire of her pain, and now they feared they could no longer control the blaze. She was changing, not just as a ruler, but as a force of nature. The ice within her no longer quiet or regal. Now it screamed like thunder across the land, and in her silence she asked the same question over and over in her mind. Where is he? Where did they take him? Every day she searched, riding beasts made of wind and ice across valleys and broken glaciers. She sent her spies to the farthest caves and storm-hidden cliffs. But each report returned empty. The warmth she once felt on her skin now felt like a lie she refused to believe. Ethan had left by choice. Something was wrong, something deeper than betrayal. One night, as the blizzard howled and blue lightning cracked across the heavens, Serenia sat alone in the great library. She ran her fingers over the ancient mirror of truth, but it showed only fog. Her reflection would not answer. Her pain would not bring visions. She clenched her fist and slammed it into the mirror, cracking it for the first time in 1,000 years. A jagged line split the surface, and in that fracture she saw something flicker. A cage made of red stone, a place beyond the ice, a land of flame and ash, where her power would weaken, where her breath would burn her lungs, and where her enemies had hidden the one who brought warmth into her soul. The fire wastes. No one from Varellus ever dared to cross them. They were forbidden lands, cursed lands, where her ancestors once waged war and lost. The fire creatures had vanished, but their hatred remained, and now she knew. Ethan had been taken there, hidden where she could not follow, but she would follow anyway. The next morning she left the palace without word, without guards, without crown. She walked into the storm barefoot, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes bright as burning stars. The snow parted before her, as if afraid to touch her. She descended the mountain and vanished into the southern wilds, where the frost ended and the fire began. Days passed, and the world watched as the storm followed her path. Glaciers cracked behind her, oceans froze in her wake. The wind howled her name across kingdoms, and old legends began to stir again. They spoke of the Ice Queen's wrath. A tale once buried, now reborn. In reality, she crossed deserts of glass and fields of smoke. Creatures of flame hissed and fled as she passed. The heat burned her feet. The wind blistered her skin, but still she walked, her determination stronger than any pain. Her power dimmed in this land, but her will only grew brighter. At the edge of a shattered volcano, she found the mark she had been waiting for, a piece of Earth technology, a torn cloth with his scent scorched and blackened, but still his. She followed the trail down into the caves where lava dripped from ceilings like liquid gold, and the walls glowed with heat that made her vision blur. Her power flared weakly, unable to fight the temperature, but her heart burned with something stronger than any cold had ever given. Here at the end of the tunnel, tied in chains of fire, she found him. Ethan lay slumped, barely breathing, his skin marked by heat and pain. But when she stepped closer, his eyes opened, just enough to see her, and he smiled even in the agony of his condition. "I knew you would come," he whispered. She fell to her knees and reached out, her hand glowing faintly despite the heat, and for the third time in her long life, she touched him, and this time it was not ice that met fire. It was love, and love made of both burned brighter than either alone. The moment Queen Serenia's hand met Ethan's broken skin, the world around them paused, not in silence, but in reverence. The cave walls stopped dripping, the molten rivers slowed, and the heat no longer burned her. It bent to her will as if the fire itself remembered her bloodline, the legacy of the first queen, who once held both flame and frost within her soul, now stood reborn in her descendant, kneeling in love. Ethan was barely conscious, his lips dry, his voice faint, but his eyes filled With light when he looked at her, "You came," he whispered again, his breath shaky and soft. "I knew you would." Serenia pressed her forehead gently against her arms trembling as she held him close. "I will never leave you again," she whispered, and with those words her frost bloomed across the burning stone, not to kill but to calm. A path of ice formed under her knees, carrying a soothing chill into the flames, not ending them. The chains of fire that bound him hissed against her. Cold light and shattered, not in violence, but in surrender. The cave rumbled, but did not collapse. Instead, it opened a passage upward, revealing a sky split between smoke and stars. Ethan tried to rise, but his body faltered. Serenia held him tighter, her voice strong now. "You are safe. I will carry you through the fire if I must." But it was not just his body she carried, it was her heart, her truth, her choice to let go of the throne that chained her to loneliness, to let go of fear and rules, and ancient silence. For the first time she chose love without permission, and the world answered her with light as they emerged from the depths of the fire wastes. A storm unlike any other met them on the horizon, not one of destruction, but of balance. Snow and ember danced together in the sky. Clouds swirled in silver and gold. Rain fell like steam that kissed the earth with new life. Creatures of Varelis and the Firelands watched in awe from the cliffs and valleys. They had never seen ice and fire walk as one. They had never believed the old stories of harmony could return, but now they did. Now they saw words spread faster than the wind. The ice queen had found her heart. The human who melted her throne had not stolen her power, but had awakened its second half. The Frost Lords trembled behind their walls, unsure whether to welcome or run, but the people of Varelis gathered at the palace gates, not in fear, but in hope. When Serenia returned to the palace with Ethan in her arms, the gates opened not with order, but with joy. The once silent halls were filled with voices again, laughter echoing where none had dared to speak openly before. The frost flowers bloomed wider and brighter than ever, their icy petals sparkling with warm light. She stood before her people, not as the untouchable monarch of winter, but as a queen with both strength and feeling. Her voice rang clear across the courtyard. "I am still your queen, but I am no longer alone, and neither are you. We are not meant to rule through fear. We are meant to endure through love and balance." The crowd bowed, not because they were forced, but because they believed in her and in the human who walked beside her. Ethan stood at her side, his steps weak but his presence strong, their hands clasped together for all to see. The symbol of a new era. Lord Tharn tried to speak, tried to challenge her, but when he looked into her eyes he saw not softness, but something far more dangerous, compassion sharpened by courage. He lowered his head and said nothing. In the days that followed, the ice across the planet began to change. It no longer suffocated the rivers, it flowed with them. It no longer silenced the sky, it sang with it. The palace itself shimmered in both frost and flame, a monument to what happens when two opposites choose not to fight, but to understand. And at the center of it all were Serenia and Ethan, a queen and a stranger, a force of winter and a soul of fire, once divided, now bound by choice, not by fate. One evening, as they stood again at the glacier balcony, Serenia turned to him and asked softly, "Do you miss Earth sometimes?" He said, "But not as much as I would miss you." She smiled, not with her lips, but with her entire being, and leaned into him. The wind wrapped around them, not cold, not hot, just right, the kind of air that only exists when a world finally breathes freely. And so the iceborn queen lived not in solitude or sorrow, but in warmth. She chose herself, and she chose love, and with one human touch her entire world changed forever. The end.